and we are continuing our discussion of Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nation lands. And of course, we do have the housekeeping measures. Talks about audio feedback. I'm sure you have a note on that, so anyone in the room, please remember your earpiece as we keep going. I'm going to get right into it because we don't have much time. I believe there is agreement amongst the parties to consolidate the two panels we have into one, and everyone gives the thumbs up here, so we are good to go. So why don't we start right away with Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill, and you have 5 minutes, Dr. Hill.
Scano Sego, I'm honored to be asked here today. I'm going to talk about the Indigenous research team, which intentionally centers Indigenous knowledge and women in addressing climate change and the water crisis we're currently experiencing, with an increasingly recognized step by the international organizations and bodies to build effective mitigation approaches to these crises. At UN Economic and Social Affairs Policy Brief from 2021, states Indigenous people are stewards of the world's biodiversity and cultural diversity. Although they account for only around 5% of the world's population, they effectively manage an estimated 20 to 25% of the Earth's land surface, including water. The land coincides with areas that hold 80% of the planet's biodiversity and about 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes. Indigenous people therefore play a key role in efforts to protect the planet's biodiversity. Focusing on the role of traditional knowledge and Indigenous women in mitigating climate change, the report notes that importance of upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples as enshrined in international law and full respect for the right of Indigenous peoples' decisions. My community of Six Nations has led a project, Indigenous, which means water in our language. Research project with Six Nations of the Grand River of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the largest populated Indigenous reserve in Canada. Six Nations community has been engaged in efforts to achieve sustainable ecosystems, health, and well-being directly tied to the state of water. As a Ganyaga Mohawk woman and a scientist living in my community, is it important to acknowledge the laws that our people have upheld long before colonial laws of the Crown. The research undertaken centers Haudenosaunee great law and responsibility to care for the water. This is embedded in our creation stories and the Thanksgiving or Ganyohano address. The Constitution of the Haudenosaunee states, whenever the Confederate leaders shall assemble for the purpose of holding a council, the leaders shall open it up by expressing their gratitude to offer thanks to the earth where men dwell, to the streams of water, the pools, the springs, and the lakes. Secretary to Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Sub-Chief Leroy Hill tells us how the Great Lakes were formed and the fresh water that Creator gave us to live on Earth. The landscape of this region is literally tied to our creation story. The Great Lakes are collectively the third largest body of drinking water globally. When Europeans arrived, they marveled at the abundance of pure, sweet drinking water. In less than 200 years, the sweet water of the Great Lakes has been contaminated and in some cases highly toxic. These numbers are expected to increase and are exacerbated by climate change and population growth. Our study found that in my community, only 10 to 12% of Six Nations residents have access to treated water piped into their homes. Nearly 30% of home and tap water sampled had unsafe levels of heavy metals, E. coli, bacteria. Majority of residents required to purchase their water, both trucked and bottled, and must pay for waste removal, causing undue economic, physical, and social hardships. Our health surveys found over half of the residents found to have daily levels of water insecurity, anxiety, impacting mental health significantly, especially for the new mothers and our elders. Only less than 5%, 0.5% of the water on this earth is usable and available fresh water, and climate change is dangerously affecting this. Only 2.6% of the world's freshwater supply is available to southern Canada, where most of the population lives, in contrast to the continental U.S. that has 3.7% of freshwater supply available for its use. Canada has a relatively high amount of freshwater available per capita. However, this availability of fresh water varies dramatically by region. 1 in 4 Canadian municipalities experienced water shortages between 94 and 99. Shortages were attributed to increases in consumption, drought, or infrastructure constraints. Consequently, changes in river flows, climate, or land use can have significant impacts on the water available to individual households. Climate change, population growth, and increasing water scarcity will put pressure on our food supply. As most of the fresh water used, about 70% on average, is used for agriculture. It takes between 2,000 to 5,000 liters of water to produce a person's daily food. As part of our project Indigenous, we identified numerous threats to the ongoing illegal extraction of groundwater by Nestle and now Blue Triton on our traditional lands as outlined Indigenous lands, leading to advocacy for the Indigenous water governance. Our documents, the water insecurity at Six Nations is further exacerbated by the selling of our sacred aquifer to corporations, which will eventually devastate our ecosystem. In response to Bill C-61, positive duty on the states to observe UN agreements, treaties, declarations, norms, including of Indigenous rights under UNDRIP, including rights to territorial integrity and resources within. Canada has an obligation to uphold UNDRIP 2621. I won't go over them. States shall give
Dr.
legal
Hill,
recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition be conducted with due respect. Am I finishing?
Yeah, if you could wrap up quickly, that'd be awesome.
Okay. The concerns we have are the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. Funding is not addressed in Bill C-61 to meaningful support water infrastructure. Funding is required for initial development and also for ongoing management training required to achieve long-lasting Indigenous water sovereignty. And I'll end it with, in our great law, we talk about the 7th generation. Youth need to be integral and central to all the works that you do in your bill and make sure that they are funded. Thank you.
And next up, we have James McKinnon from the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. You have 5 minutes.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I'll be providing comments on behalf of the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, which I'll be referring to as AFNWA for the remainder of my time. The AFNWA is a first-of-its-kind full-service water and wastewater utility that is owned and operated by its participating First Nations. Currently, we provide service to 13 nations in Atlantic Canada. The AFNWA is a not-for-profit organization led by its participating First Nations with a board comprised primarily of First Nations chiefs who have carefully developed incorporation documents, governance manual, and bylaws to guide their decision-making. The AFNWA Board of Directors is supported and informed by our Elders Advisory Lodge. The Elders provide guidance on First Nations value, cultures, and knowledge, and offer advice to the Board to ensure the AFNWA is not solely a copy of a Western utility model. The foundation of AFNWA's success to date is, in large part, due to its alignment and connection of funding to treatment, monitoring, and operation standards through an Indigenous-informed governance framework. The legislation being studied by the Standing Committee is central to the sustainability of the AFNWA and embodies many of the tenets that have been central to our progress, such as a commitment to a funding framework based on actual costs of operations and maintenance and responsive to projected infrastructure needs. These themes are also embedded in the AFNWA's 10-year business plan, developed and approved by the AFNW Board in 2022, with the vision to strengthen programs and approaches to service delivery in the spirit of self-determination and reconciliation. It is in this context that the AFNWA supports many elements of this legislation. However, there are key aspects of the legislation that could be improved, and I'd like to take the remaining time to outline some of these opportunities. First Nations water quality is currently unregulated. However, Bill C-61 allows for First Nations to create their own regulations for water and wastewater quality, which at a minimum must align with the guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality and either the wastewater system effluent regulations or provincial standards. It's the AFNWA's opinion that future wastewater regulations must also consider environmental risk assessments to the receiving water body. The AFNWA supports water and wastewater regulations as a regulatory framework supports operational and design conditions for the AFNWA. However, regulations developed under Bill C-61 must be met with adequate funding. Section 27.5 states that the minister must make best efforts to begin consultations on a funding framework within 6 months of the section coming into force. This is encouraging. However, while there is a mandate to start the work, there is no required deadline to finish it. Communities would be well served if there was a commitment to finalize the funding framework in partnership with First Nations within 2 years of the legislation achieving royal assent. Further to funding, if a First Nation creates standards above the guidelines for Canadian drinking water quality or wastewater system effluent regulations, the funding framework must also provide adequate funding to design, install, operate, maintain, and monitor the infrastructure required to meet those standards. Perhaps most importantly, Section 27.2d identifies enforcement as an element to be considered in the funding framework. Because there is no precedent for enforcing regulations regarding water services in First Nations, and Section 24 enables the minister or provincial, territorial, or municipal government, or any public body acting under the authority of a First Nation to enforce First Nation laws, or preferably a First Nations design and led enforcement body, it is unclear what the actual cost of enforcement will be. Laws without oversight are protocols. As we see in the present circumstance, protocols alone are insufficient. Further to regulations, we understand that they will only be as effective as the trained professionals who work to adhere to them. As the only First Nations water utility in Canada, I want to state that additional equitable and culturally appropriate opportunities for First Nations personnel in the water sector are needed. Furthermore, funding support for First Nations youth and water professionals is essential for fully realizing water regulations in Bill C-61. Lastly, we are encouraged to note that any standards developed will apply to both individual or decentralized systems, as well as public or centralized water and wastewater systems. That said, decentralized drinking water systems, including individual wells and truck-to-cistern systems, are often not monitored for bacteriological or chemical safety, resulting in a poor understanding of water quality. Decentralized water and wastewater systems, or decentralized wastewater systems, as is with water systems, receive little to no federal funding for the actual cost of operations, maintenance, or replacement. This can leave aging and failing septic systems to release untreated or undertreated wastewater to the environment. Where necessary, the Act should explicitly mention and address the very significant challenges associated with decentralized systems and how to safeguard these systems from failure, inclusive of funding. Bill C-61, if constructed well, would help expand the AFNWA's mission to include both centralized and decentralized systems to provide holistic water services to our member First Nations, thereby reducing the service gap often experienced by communities. I would like to close by thanking the committee for their invitation to appear here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. We are next, according to my list, the next witness is online. We go to Chief Roy, please, of the Kainai First Nation. I think just on mute, Chief, sorry.
Okay, nakakia aukakshima pikwen kithonak samatsim opua nistoako ka bakidiba. On behalf of the Kainai Blood Tribe, we send you our greetings from the land of the Kainai Blood Tribe. My traditional name is Bakidiba, and I just wanted to quickly share a bit of history about our tribe and the relationship that we have with Ohoki water. Of course, we will support any bill that any legislation that will confirm our ownership of our water in, on, under, and boundary our reserve lands, and then as well our inherent right to govern that water. The history that I want to quickly share with you is that our reserve is bounded by 4 rivers. The St. Mary, the Belly, the Waterton, and the Old Man River. And of course, that is our water. Other jurisdictions have tried to lay claim on that water, but it is ours. We use the water for drinking purposes, domestic purposes, as well as for agricultural purposes. We have the largest irrigation farm in Canada. And of course, you know, we fully utilize the irrigation that takes place. We are the largest producers of Timothy forage hay in Canada and soon to be in North America. We export to many countries. And so water, the use of water, the ownership of water is not a new matter to us. We will continue to use the water that boundaries our reserve. So that it is important that this bill has to include any amendments with respect that waters that boundary reserves, not just the ones in, under, within the reserve, but it's so important to us. So important to us. We certainly, of course, support Chief Crowfoot's call for amendments to recognize that First Nations have a human rights to safe drinking water. And as well, Chief Knowlton's comments about being able to utilize our waters for other purposes, such as agriculture. So, you know, we really want to emphasize that some amendments have to be made. Source water protection is so important to us, but because of the rivers that I mentioned that boundary on a reserve, most of that source is from the United States of America, from the state of Montana, but more importantly, from the lands of our cousins, the Blackfeet in Montana, who are a part of our confederacy. So we, of course, you know, we share the water rights issues that they have as well. And I need to get back to an important conference that we are hosting for the membership of the Confederacy. It's an important conference on our language, and of course I have to get back and make some closing remarks. So thank you, and I would request that our senior counsel, Dorothy Firstrider, then represent me after my initial presentation. So thank you, Chairperson and members of the committee, for giving us some time to make our comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Roy, and good luck at the rest of your conference, and I'm sure they will appreciate your closing remarks. Next up, we have Chief Troy Knowlton from the Piikani First Nation, and Chief, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
5 minutes. All right.
And then questions and comments
fast.
after.
Thank you very much for having us here today. I'm Piikani Nation Chief Troy Knowlton. It's Troy Bossman Knowlton. The people back home know me as, and my traditional name is Bearhead. So I'll read a little bit of here, and then I'll just add a little bit. So is there a clock I can look at? I'd like to thank the committee for ensuring that Piikani Nation and other Blackfoot nations have the opportunity to speak to you about our Bill C-61. I want to start by helping you appreciate who we are and what we have faced as First Nations when it comes to water. You have before you today 3 First Nations that have been in front lines of the First Nation water rights in this country. My comments will be from Piikani's perspective, but I know that Siksika and Kainai have grappled with the same challenges. As Chief Fox mentioned, the Blackfoot Treaty region is one of the most water-scarce regions in Canada. From 1857 to 1860, Captain John Palliser led an expedition across the Canadian prairies to assess the potential for the region. In his report, Palliser noted the large arid area that was likely unstable for agriculture. That area included much of the Blackfoot Treaty region. It became known as Palliser's Triangle. When Canada entered into the Blackfoot Treaty in 1877, it knew that water was critically important to the reserve lands promised in the treaty. Even so, Canada has done little or nothing over the past century to protect the treaty water rights of the Blackfoot until Bill C-61. When Alberta assumed control over water in the province from Canada, it entrenched a system of water licensing, first in time, first in right. The system is intended to ensure that during times of drought, older or more senior water licenses will not be impacted, and more junior water license holders have to reduce water use. The first in time, first in right system utterly fails to respect that the Blackfoot Nations were using water in the region for thousands of years before European colonization. This is not an academic issue. The government of Alberta has maintained that it owns and has jurisdiction over all Blackfoot Nations reserve lands, jurisdiction over all water on Blackfoot Nation reserve lands, and it has asserted that control without reference to history, our treaty water rights, or the water needs of our nation. These issues led to a standoff in 1990 at the Piikani Nation over the construction of the Oman River Dam and nearly ended in violence. Now, when I say nearly ended in violence, there was shots fired. I was part of the camp, in a encampment of 100 people or so, that were faced off against the province over the construction of the Oman River Dam that was going to decimate a lot of our ancestral territories, and it did. And it was built against federal environmental statutes. Alberta went and did it anyway. For a few millionaires that lived downstream in the agriculture belt of southern Alberta. Well, those millionaires are billionaires today, and they've created a lot more. Whereas the Piikani Nation, we haven't benefited the way we ought to have been. We had a water rights case that was put into abeyance in 1998. We negotiated a deal with Canada and Alberta over the jurisdiction of the water, put it into abeyance. And today we have problems with that. Bill C-61 may help us to alleviate some of those long-standing problems. Although it's a touchy issue for many of us when it comes to the water and jurisdiction and ownership, we assert that we are stewards of the land and that first in time, first in right, either make reference to the Blackfoot people who were there first in time, first in right. So I thank you for the time today. The chiefs, I know, have other issues that we want to talk about, but there are certain measures in here that are amenable to us, that we could work with, that will strengthen some of our jurisdictional issues as well as future. But there's still a lot that needs to be addressed in here. And I'll speak specifically for my northern brothers and sisters who lack in infrastructure, who lack in different water qualities, in the oil sands. I have friends and families up north who are dying at an alarming rate because of water contamination. And how is this going to help them? And there is opposition from many First Nations because of that, and it does not address a lot of their problems. For the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Oman River runs right through my reserve. And we're close to the headwaters, and so because there are provisions in here for source water, for safe drinking water, for wastewater, there are many areas that we can appreciate. But we've got of course, more needs to be done, and I think you all could understand that when you look at the bill, you look at the history, and look at where we're going. So.
Thank you very much, Chief, for those words. Next up, I have two names, so I'm not sure who would like to speak from the Siksika Nation, please. 5 minutes.
Okay, Nistawanak Nookske Stomach, Chief Ore Crowfoot, Siksika First Nation. I'd like to thank the chair and the committee members for providing the opportunity for Siksika to be the Blackfoot Nations to speak regarding Bill C-61. I'd like to thank Chief Otukan, Troy Knowlton, as well as Makinima Roy Fox from the Blood Tribe. We are three distinct nations, but we are one nation, similar to the Iroquois Confederacy. Matter of fact, just a month ago, the Blackfeet Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy made some alliances to work together because we have a lot of similarities in our proximity, our populations. We're large confederacies, and we have a lot of commonalities, but that's another story for another day. But the Blackfeet Nation, Siksika, we support Bill C-61. This does not mean that we think the bill is perfect. As mentioned by Chief Knowlton, The minister has committed to making further amendments, which we will speak of today. I want to start, though, by focusing on the critically important, long overdue historical rights recognition contained in Bill C-61. When me and my cousin Sam Crowfoot, our great-great-great-grandfather was Ishupul Mokshika, Chief Crowfoot, the signer of the Blackfoot Treaty, or one of the signers, entered into the Blackfoot Treaty with Canada in 1877. Water was clearly fundamental to that treaty. Canada committed to support Siksika's transition to agriculture and other economic developments on our reserve lands. At that time, the Blackfeet, previous to the treaty, we were a buffalo people. We were a nomadic people. We followed the lands, the buffalo, all over the lands, and our stories tie us to these waters. Our stories tie us to these lands, similar as mentioned by the Six Nations and their stories to the water and to the lands. But when the reserve, after the Treaty of 1877, the transition from Canada was to create farmers for the Blackfeet and other economic opportunities on those lands. Despite this, many times since 1877, we've been told we have no water rights and that the water on our lands and under our feet is not our water, and that we have no rights to govern our water. With Bill C-61, that comes to an end. It's taken over 147 years, but finally Canada is set to recognize our treaty rights to the water on, in, and under our lands, and our inherent right to govern the water according to our traditional values. For this reason alone, Siksika supports Bill C-61. With respect to the right of every First Nation to their own position on Bill C-61. Having said that, I need to address the consultation process on the bill. We don't think it was perfect. Even so, Canada started by asking for our understanding of our treaty water rights. And for the first time ever, we had opportunities to review and comment on draft legislation. Although we had to fight hard, Canada responded with critically important changes to the bill. After 2 years of significant consultation, the recognition of our inherent right of self-government over water was broadened beyond just drinking water, infrastructure, to all aspects of water. The assurance of sufficient water supplies in Section 15 was also a direct response to the Blackfoot Nations. The committee needs to appreciate that every First Nation has had some opportunity to consult about the bill. However, there are still serious issues with the bill. The legislation is supposed to end Canada's shameful legacy of neglect, underfunding, and discrimination against First Nations' access to safe drinking water, but it falls short. Canada commits to best efforts to ensure First Nations have safe drinking water. In light of Canada's century of failure on safe drinking water, First Nations must not ask to accept and trust that Canada's best efforts will be effective. Many First Nations across the country share this concern with Bill C-61. A clear and simple amendment can help address this. In the preamble of the bill, Canada cites the UN resolution confirming safe drinking water is a human right. Canada needs to recognize that right in the body of the bill. The Blackfoot Nations are seeking an amendment to Section 3 that would read, 3 of 3, for greater clarity, it is recognized and affirmed that First Nations people have a human right to safe drinking water consistent with United Nations Resolution 64-292, and that pursuant to this act, the human right of safe drinking water means that all First Nation members resident on First Nation lands have a right to drink water that possesses no risk to human health or well-being. When Canada started consultation on Bill C-61 in 2022, it told First Nations across Canada it would affirm and recognize our rights. At least a dozen AFN General Assembly resolutions and many resolutions by the Alberta Assembly of Treaty Chiefs have consistently called on Canada to recognize that First Nations have a human right to safe drinking water. It should be observed that the legislation meant to ensure that First Nations have safe drinking water, that the primary right to be enshrined must be First Nations' right to safe drinking water.
Chief, I'm sorry. You've gone about 2 minutes over.
Okay,
Is
2
there any way
seconds.
you can wrap? Yeah, okay. Thank
Our
you.
proposed amendment will also inform what is meant by the phrase best efforts in C-61. Best efforts mean that First Nations mothers, children, and elders have a right to turn on their taps in their homes, and the water that comes out possess no risk to their human health or well-being. Bill C-61 presents an historic opportunity for Canada to finally do the right thing and recognize that First Nations people have a human right to safe drinking water. Gun.
Thank you very much, Chief. Our last speaker is, I believe, Clayton Leonard. That is correct, from the Blackfoot First Nations.
Thank you. I'd just like to start by thanking the committee for making time and paying attention to our submissions on C-61. I'm here as a legal counsel to the Blackfoot Nations, so of course I have to. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I have to speak in support of the amendments they're seeking. But before I get into those points, I'd like to speak from a personal perspective. I had my first file about unsafe drinking water at a First Nation 20 years ago. And there's been a constant flow of those issues ever since. I shouldn't be in front of this committee 20 years after the fact asking Canada to do the right thing on First Nation drinking water. I'm not Indigenous, and like most Canadians, I have the good fortune to turn on the tap in my home or my office and not give a second thought to the water that comes out of the tap. But I've spent a lot of time in First Nation communities hearing from people that live firsthand with water that threatens their well-being on a daily basis. I've seen elders in tears as they recount having to struggle physically to get bottled water into their homes. I've seen dirty, smelly water coming out of a fountain in a First Nation school. And perhaps one of the most shocking moments to me was seeing a billboard that was pretty much permanent, warning people in the community that there's a do not consume order. Just imagine that for a moment. You know, we all focused heavily on drinking water advisories and boil water advisories. That community literally every day gets up and they can't boil the water, they can't drink it, or they'll get sick. And that's been in place for a number of years. The unsafe drinking water in First Nations homes, schools, and community buildings is among the worst kind of discrimination our country has inflicted on First Nation peoples. It's a disregard for their humanity. I'm happy that Canada's taken steps to address this over the last few years, but it's not enough, and more has to be done. Bill C-61 is a good start, but it asks First Nations, despite Canada's legacy, to trust that new best efforts will be enough to ensure safe drinking water in their communities. With Canada's legacy of discrimination against First Nations in general, and particularly with regard to unsafe drinking water, it's irrational and indefensible to ask First Nations to trust that. This is why Bill C-61 needs at least one very critical amendment. It's time to stop with half measures and do the right thing by expressly recognizing that First Nations people living in their communities have a human right to turn on the tap and face no risk to their human health or well-being. Nothing less is acceptable. The proposed amendment recognizing that First Nations have a right to safe drinking water is critical to reconciliation as well, and is consistent, as Chief Crowfoot pointed out, with over a dozen AFN Chiefs and Assembly resolutions from 2011 to 2023, which I provided to the clerk of the committee. The amendment will address what's very common, the most common criticism from First Nations about the bill, that it doesn't do enough to ensure that First Nations will be assured access to safe drinking water. Canada endorsed UN Resolution 64-292 on the human right to safe drinking water. Did it mean it or not? It references that resolution in the preamble, which means it's within the scope of the bill. But it's lip service if it's not in the body of the legislation. Funding is also fundamental. It's been about 18 years since the expert panel on safe drinking water concluded that resources, a lot of them, are needed before regulation happens. As we know, that was the key failing of the first crack at this kind of legislation. It wasn't backed by resources for First Nations. Well, the $6 billion commitment now that accompanies the bill will finally address this. And I think it's important to note that the funding commitment, although it flows from the class action, the minister has clarified in writing to a number of First Nations that that funding is for all First Nations in Canada. But there's still a serious funding issue with the bill. There will be a two-tiered level of access to the $6 billion in water infrastructure funding. The 271 nations under the class action will have access to a binding third-party resolution process, which means that if one of those communities, for example, gets a engineering assessment done of their system that identifies a $10 million need, and ISC says, no, here's 7, they have recourse under section 9.06 to 9.08 of the settlement agreement to get a binding, bring that to a binding dispute resolution process and compel ISC to fund the full $10 million. This is a critically important funding mechanism that will not be available to 348 First Nations across the country. 60% are going to be left behind. And at the mercy of ISC funding decisions.
You've gone about
so
45
really
seconds
critical.
over. If you could either quickly wrap up or
Yeah.
we can probably get to you in questions.
I can do that. It's critical that the committee take a look at attaching that to the bill in some fashion. I'll just close by re-stressing the need to seriously consider the amendment that's been proposed to recognize that First Nations have a right to safe drinking water. If one amendment makes it into the bill from this committee, that's the one that needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our witnesses. Some great testimony here. Unfortunately, we'll have time for one round only, but it is a 6-minute round for each of the parties. We'll start with the Conservatives. It is Martin Shields, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here and appreciate you being here in person. I know Chief Fox had to leave, but I appreciate him making a statement. One of the things that affects Chief Fox more than some of you is the international piece. And I know we've talked about that before. Like when the Milk River had a bust here, and that sort of disrupted the Milk River, but that infrastructure is on the U.S. side. So that's another challenge we have in the sense when you've got an amendment here you want to make about quantity. We've got an international agreement with water and water rights with the U.S., the amount we get, but the infrastructure is the other issue of that being maintained, and that affects Kainai more than anybody else. And that's something we have to pay attention when we work on this in the sense of quantity. The other part that's been mentioned about with climate change, and having listened to many different people on climate change, they say we will have more quantities at different times. So storage becomes the issue. So storage in the sense of water for quantity, when I talk about that, Chief Crowfoot, you're very familiar with storage part of your nation. How do we address that if we get less periodic rain, but it's much more extensive? So storage becomes an issue, and that leads into your motion or your amendment you'd like to do with quantity. And I know you didn't get a chance to talk about it, so would you like to talk about your amendment to do with quantity?
Okay, I'll yield that comment to Sam Crowfoot.
Okay.
Okay. Alberta has not been a responsible steward of our water. No Blackfoot Nation has ever accepted Alberta's assertion of control over water on our lands, and no court has confirmed that Alberta has any jurisdiction over our water on our reserve lands. In fact, in 2006, an expert report commissioned by the Government of Canada concluded that water on reserve lands could not be governed by provincial water laws due to Section 9124 of the Constitution Act. We are not here to rehash the difficult history of water colonialism in Alberta. The reason for this background is to help the committee appreciate and understand the critical importance of the recognition of our ownership and our inherent right of self-government over our water on our lands in Bill C-61. The recognition of our treaty rights is historic and long overdue. However, the bill falls short of what is necessary in Section 15, which currently reads, "The quantity of water available on the First Nation lands of a First Nation must meet the drinking, cooking, sanitation, hygiene, safety, fire protection, and emergency management needs of the First Nation, based on its current and projected water usage needs." The assurance in Section 15 of sufficient quantity of water available to First Nations is a good start, but is not consistent with Canada's treaty obligations with the Blackfoot Nations. Under the terms of the Blackfoot Treaty, otherwise known as Treaty 7, we have a right to enough water to fully use, benefit from, live on, and develop our lands. The listed water uses in Section 15 must also include water for agriculture and economic development to be consistent with the Blackfoot Treaty. This is a simple but very critical and necessary amendment to the bill. Thank you.
So when we talk about first in time, first and right, which is provincial organized water system, you're dealing nation to nation with the federal government. So would you believe then it's the federal government that then needs to deal with the provincial under their water rights first in time, first and right?
I've been asked to address that question. I think if this bill passes, what it does is creates a new conversation around that. So instead of trying to fit First Nations into a system that's been in place since 1897, after 22,000 licenses have already been issued in southern Alberta, it takes them out of it and creates a level playing field for government discussion with Alberta about the use of water in a watershed, including on reserve lands. And that hasn't happened in the past. They've been treated as stakeholders, and if they're lucky, they've been consulted. It'll also change things like you may be aware that the government of Alberta is considering a new dam on the Bow River between Cochrane and Calgary. Siksika, despite a lot of efforts to have a conversation with Alberta about that, has been left on the sidelines. They're the only nation downstream from what's going to be the biggest addition of a reservoir on the Bow River in the last quarter century. Why aren't they at the table and a partnership in a project like that?
But that's not the biggest one that's being proposed, and that's just below them.
Yeah.
Are they at the table at that one? Because there's a bigger one being proposed just below the Bazzano Dam, which they well know. Have you had any part of the discussions, or will you, on that one?
No, that's not been the case. In fact, the massive expansion in southern Alberta, which is largely significantly funded by the federal government, has included no consultation. The Blackfoot Nations made a request for federal engagement on that, including a federal environmental assessment of each of those reservoirs, and the request was declined.
It was declined for the one below the Bazzano Dam?
Yes.
Not to be allowed in consultation?
We requested a federal environmental review, and it was declined. That's
Okay.
the Snake.
No, it's not the Snake. Snake's above the Bazzano Dam. I'm
Which-
talking
which-
about the
do
new
you know
one
the name
below,
of the one?
Emor Dam. That's on, that the provincial government has got funding towards the studies for that one. Okay, time, thanks.
Yep, okay, quickly. Yep, if you don't mind. Oh, okay.
To address the comment. So at the end of the day, the federal government and the Blackfoot Nation signed into a treaty in 1877. Alberta came into Confederation in 1905, 1906. Our agreement is not with the province. And anything that happens on the federal lands, and you said what we feel the federal government ought to play, what part they ought to play? Well, you ought to be behind us or in front of us or beside us in any battles we're going to have with Alberta. That's federal jurisdiction. Your obligation and fiduciary responsibility of Alberta, of Canada, is to protect the First Nations that you signed treaty with. And if that means opposing Alberta, which we know is going to happen, then we got to fight this together. And this is why you're getting support for Bill C-61, because we know darn well what Alberta's going to do, what their next steps are. They don't have to announce it. We know. And that fight's going to take place, I guarantee you, within the next year.
Okay, thank you very much. We now go to the Liberal Party for their 6 minutes. Ms. Adwin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being with us today. This is critically important testimony, and it will absolutely inform our work moving forward. And I really take note of the stronger language that's required and the lack of trust around the terminology best efforts. And so I really take that to heart. And of course, recognizing the human right to access to clean water as well. I represent the riding of Fredericton or Mukto. It's in New Brunswick. It's in the territory of the unceded, unsurrendered Wolastoqiyik people, so the people of the river. And so the multi-jurisdictional reality for me is critically important. It's interprovincial. It rolls into the United States as well. So I'm also very interested in seeing this bill, proceed because again, there's the reluctant provincial governments often that we have to deal with. It's been a roadblock for far too long. I would actually like to just turn my attention to the Atlantic First Nation Water Authority, just because, again, it really concerns the communities that I represent. And so, you signed an agreement with the Government of Canada in 2022 that involved a 10-year funding commitment for operations and capital programs. Now that decades-long funding commitment has been made, how has that changed the approach to supporting and overseeing water systems and operations for the communities served by the authority?
I really appreciate the question, and I would say that the change has been truly systemic, right? I would start with the decision-making on funding for capital projects. That would go directly to our board of directors instead of an application to ISC. So we've been able to implement a long-term strategic plan for the infrastructure in our communities. The other side of it is that we have the dedicated increased funding for operations and maintenance. So when a community becomes a member of the AFNWA, their staff, the operations staff, become our employees. So they are supported by our engineering department, our technical staff, as well as our back office HR department, right? So with the increased resources, we're able to support the operators on the ground, but also implement our long-term strategic infrastructure plans.
And also, so in the agreement, a news release that accompanied it, it mentioned that the service delivery transfer agreement sets out both Indigenous Service Canada's and the AFNWA's mutual obligations, accountability, and understanding for implementation. So it's essentially has this shared accountability baked into the agreement. Can you speak to how that's also, helped support operations?
Yeah, so when we signed the service delivery transfer agreement, we received certain responsibilities that used to be Canada's, so all policy administrative work with water and wastewater, that comes directly to us. So we're accountable to Canada through our funding agreement, which of course any not-for-profit would have to report on our funding, but we're more accountable to our communities. So we give annual reports based on what the quality of water has been, what the infrastructure updates have been, and what's going to be a plan in the future. So that shared accountability has really been kind of empowered us to move forward on upgrading the infrastructure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Dr. Martin Hill, I'd like to address some questions to you as well, and I really appreciated the idea of centering women as well in the work that you do, and I think that's critically important. So given your extensive work in this field, how do you envision the structure and role of the First Nations Water Commission, which is a really essential piece of this legislation?
So I think that we worked with the Canadian Water Agency to look at ways to engage Indigenous women. If you know anything about the new stamp that just came out honoring Josephine, women have been trying to have their voices heard regarding water for some time, and they largely have not been at the table in their own communities, including myself. We tend to do the work on the grassroots level. We improve services, we ensure elders have water, but we're not at the decision-making table. So when I visited the ANC in South Africa when they first came into power, and I visited the Land Claims Commission and Water Commission there, they ensured that all committees had 50% women at all tables at all times, and I think that's a good standard to go by. As a matriarchal society, we would be the ones in control historically, especially of water, and the men would be supporting our decisions. But because of colonialism, we tend to have been pushed into the shadows along with youth who are desperately needed and training. We're trying to develop a research institute to train our young people because they're going to be inheriting quite a mess, if you will. The Grand River has over 100 dams. It's our source water. It has 100 years of contamination from Uniroyal, which made Agent Orange and other things. So we really have a big job, and we're not preparing this generation, either Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to work together to improve the quality of our source water.
Well, thank you very much. My time is winding down, but just a note on the dams. Again, the Willistook River has been dammed and choked off for decades now. And my stepfather is the Willistook Grand Chief of the territory, and his role is to look after the water. And his grandfather just always referred to them as the dams. So just thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Atwin. Actually, 15 seconds early, so all right. To the Bloc Québécois for 6 minutes, please.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all members of the committee. It really does show that we are doing a thorough job by holding today's meeting, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for your patience. So, Madam Martin-Hill, is there need for a commission that will monitor water quality in real time and that will be open to the public?
I didn't get apologies, I didn't get a translation.
Are you on the English channel?
It's on Channel 1.
Check, suspend quickly, and just hold tight here.
Je peux reprendre, Monsieur le Président?
Yep, okay, cameras are back on. You will start from the beginning. Thank you.
Je ne voudrais pas contester votre autorité. Madame
Martin-Hill, a system that keeps track of water quality in real time, should it be established and should it be open to the public so that data will be transparent?
Thank you for that question. Yes, our community, we've been doing extensive work with all stakeholders, including just widespread community engagement, and they all want access to data. So we've been developing sensors with our engineers. We have different teams working on tap water sensors, free chlorine, as well as data from the Grand River. The Grand River Conservation Authority did not put any sensors along Six Nations. Surprise, surprise. So we have zero data on the Grand River, which is our source water. So we're developing sensors, and we're connecting it through computer engineers at McMaster to a live mapping system that we have been developing with the Amazon Conservation Team, who's also mapping their rivers in the Amazon. So we're trying to get real-time data in sensors that are meaningful to our people, especially mothers who want to know whether they can go in the water, whether they can eat the fish, etc. They want to be able to open up an app or an accessor technology and just be able to see color-coded. So we want access to data. All data is relevant, and my understanding is we're willing to share it, because the goal is to improve water quality, not just for Indigenous people, but as our elder said, what we're producing, I have to always consider our neighbors under the two-row so that all mothers and all children have access to clean water, because we all know with climate change and algae blooms that are going to be more pervasive, water can become quite dangerous and toxic without other contaminants. So real-time data is going to become important, not just to Indigenous people, but right now I'm like scrambling to find a grant here and there to fund all of this when it feels like I'm doing the government's job. Thank you.
Dr. Martin Hill, I'd like to ask you another question. I asked this to officials last week. So in light of recent research on the impact of environmental
Comment le gouvernement devrait-il aborder la responsabilité des entreprises et des organisations responsables de la pollution, de l'utilisation de produits chimiques dangereux et d'autres pratiques susceptibles de provoquer, entre autres, des modifications épigénétiques préjudiciables chez les individus et leurs descendants autochtones dans le cadre du projet de loi C-61?
So sorry, but we didn't get the interpretation into English.
We'll testing.
This is the English channel, testing the English channel.
If you could start from not the beginning, but just your question.
Avec grand plaisir.
With pleasure, Mr. Chair. So, in light of recent research on the impact of environmental factors on the mode of living of Indigenous communities, how should the government approach the responsibility of companies and organizations responsible for pollution, for having used dangerous chemicals and other practices that might impact and bring about epigenetical changes in individuals and their Indigenous descendants as part of Bill C-61?
Thank you for that question. I think the research that we've been exposed to anyway suggests that, again, epigenetics is being impacted. There are changes not only to female fish turning into male fish into female. Like, it's complicating genetics, not just for the aquatic life, but also human life. We see that in stats lowering how many girls are born. And when you look at mitochondrial DNA, it becomes even more complex and quite fearsome in what we're seeing with the maternal study that we did. We're reporting young men who are now sterile at higher rates. So we're seeing a real impact on the health and well-being and the future of our people is at peril. So how would we address this? Health needs to get involved. The work of public health started in Canada because of water and airborne diseases. And for some reason, they've disconnected those things. And I've been advocating at the tri-council level policy with the Canadian Institute of Health Research that we need to do far more to prepare the populations, to have them aware of what's happening and what are the dangers to their health and well-being, including epigenetics. So I would suggest that when we have an authority of women, because the first thing the women did was said we need to look at maternal health, which I would have honestly probably not looked at, but they wanted birthing centers to pull data together, which is what they did, and what they found was quite alarming. So we need to include health. That's how I would be addressing this, because if you can do what you did for COVID as a country, and you know that's a crisis, you know that that was a looming crisis, and yet with climate change and what we're seeing, the evolution of the types of diseases that are going to be released, the heat that is going to be taking lives, not even cities are prepared. So First Nations are most vulnerable. The United Nations has asserted that. So we need to be able to have a holistic approach in the way that we would manage water, understanding that it's inextricably tied to human health and well-being. And that's how I would manage it if I could dream it up. We would have a health authority working with the water authority, and Six Nations is already doing this. Our biggest supporters have been Six Nations Health Services in all of this work. Thank you.
Mr. Lemaire, just before, sorry, you have about a minute left. I think there's a bit of an issue when you're asking your questions, you're going a bit too fast. So if you could just a touch, just slow it down a touch, and then our interpreters will be able to get that message through. Thanks.
Parfait.
Great, Mr. Chair. And thank you for highlighting that. And I do support the work of our interpreters. And I will try to be more mindful when I'm asking my question. So one little last question in the last minute that remains. Do you think that can we recognize even more the responsibility of pollutants and introduce this into the bill so whoever pollutes should pay? That notion should be in the bill.
I think I caught some of that. So there are cases in Italy and other places that are, in fact, holding companies liable for the damage that they've done or the climate disasters that will be coming our way. This bill doesn't touch any of that. In fact, it kind of strays from being very direct in saying the liability for the damage and death caused by development is not in there. So give you one example, Nestle, one of the biggest companies in the world, they're taking our aquifer water. It's blue gold. It's worth more than oil. And for some reason, our governments are giving it away at $500 per permit. And then our people go without water and go up to Caledonia, and then they have to buy Nestle bottled water. It's insanity from where I sit as a Mohawk woman, but also as a researcher to see. We evaluated how much they take 3.6 million liters a day every single day for the last 8 years. If you look at $1 a liter, which we all know is not what it costs, they've made almost $1 trillion. What have we received out of that $1 trillion that Nestle has made on our waters that are on our treaties lands? So this is a very low-cost kind of production. And the United Nations have been clear, no aquifer, no groundwater should be touched. You see what's happening in California, which is it's on fire. When you drain the veins of Mother Earth, which is aquifer, you're going to have death and destruction. We're now looking at things happening with the boreal forest because of the fracking and so on. So aquifer should be the most protected water on the planet, which is what the UN wants us to see. I don't see any of those things in this bill, and it would be incredible if Canada stood up to be a leader under this First Nations Water Act to demonstrate what we should be doing, not what we're looking at the past. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was your time. Unfortunately, it goes to the NDP now, or I guess fortunately for them, it goes to the NDP. You have 6 minutes, Ms. Sidlett.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming here and giving us your presentation regarding good, safe water. It is very important to us. We know how important it is and how it affects our well-being. Too bad we do not have enough time. There are many other things that you would like to tell us about clean water or lack of it. And if you could continue to raise issues that you didn't get a chance to speak, I would like you to feel welcome to write to us the rest of the presentation that you may not have had time to present here, so that this bill will serve the people when implemented and passed. I'd like to say the Auditor General and the justice system and the Indigenous people have told us how many are working in the federal government. They were told 634 Indigenous self-governments. What we were told that only 181 have clean water. Clean water is very important to us. We need more clean water in all the reservations. In the bill, as proposed, will have to address all the issues and address that 634. And we need to protect clean water and water, protect water, period. I'd like to ask you all, maybe starting with James, you can respond, and Troy can be the last to respond. I'm very concerned about this regarding clean water in indigenous communities. It belonged to indigenous people, the right. Then it was taken away from them. Now they are trying to give it back to us under proposed Bill C-61. What is it that we have to look at to ensure clean water and that we have the proper resources to have clean water in our reservations? And that means monetary and infrastructure, all that we need. Thank you.
Given that First Nations had authority and jurisdiction over water before colonialism, and through this bill, that jurisdiction is to be handed back to First Nations after it was stolen from First Nations. My question to you guys is, what are your recommendations to improve this bill to make sure that that jurisdiction is handed over with the resources that you will need to exercise your jurisdiction? We need to make sure, with strong language from each of you, how will you know if your jurisdiction is respected through this bill?
Thank you very much for the question. I would say there's a few important things from the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority's perspective that we would recommend. I know in the bill it allows for First Nations governing bodies to be enacted and set forth regulations. And from a regulatory standpoint, I think that having First Nations or First Nations governing bodies, the ability to develop these regulations is incredibly important. In fact, I think regulations and funding are connected. One has to come before the other. We don't know how much money we need until we develop our regulations, right? And with those regulations, we can then set forward how much money we need and what our long-term strategic vision for that infrastructure would be. Now, would that be other utilities across Canada, much the way the AFNWA is set up? Maybe. Maybe it's on an individual First Nation basis. But I think having the flexibility within the funding to achieve what you want is incredibly important. And I'll give an example. So some of our communities in Cape Breton are bordering the Bredor Lakes, and that's a very sensitive receiving body for wastewater. So right now, ISC would approve funding based on the wastewater system effluent regulations. But the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment would actually recommend a higher level of treatment. And if First Nations want to achieve that higher level of treatment, I think the flexibility in the funding framework would be required so they can meet those discharge objectives.
Thank you. And if everyone else could have a response briefly.
So what I had put in here was that an independent committee would need to be established in consultation and cooperation with First Nations governing bodies, required to produce annual reports as the result of consultation and collaboration, as well as a 5-year review report on the provisions and operation of the Act. While the bill invokes the principle of substantive equality, it does not explicitly recognize a human right to safe drinking water. This omission is considered inconsistent with Canada's support for the right to safe drinking water as a human right at the United Nations. The bill requires the federal government to use best efforts to produce the sufficient funding for water and wastewater services. However, this language is seen as providing a loophole that could allow the government to avoid ensuring that First Nations have access to clean and safe drinking water. Implementing the bill's provision effectively requires a significant collaboration and coordination between federal, provincial, and territorial First Nation governments. The complexity of water governance and the need for integrative data sets and shared decision-making mechanism pose challenges. Although the bill requires decisions to be guided by the informed, free, prior, informed consent, which is central to this argument, it does not mandate that the decision makers align their choices with the first principles of free, prior, informed consent. This needs to include more than the full recognition and meaningful implementation of FPIC, which many First Nations see as essential. The bill allows different minimum standards for different locations to address local circumstances. This provision could lead to lower standards for First Nations communities compared to non-First Nation communities. The bill aims to address longstanding issues of underfunding and regulatory gaps that have resulted in inadequate water infrastructure on First Nations land. These gaps have contributed to social and health disparities in First Nation communities. So I would be suggesting a separate autonomous authority would be the oversight of what's happening across the country, and none of that is in this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our witnesses. That was some great testimony and some fantastic questions, too. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and that will conclude this meeting. Hang on one sec. We do appreciate the opportunity to get that information. I do see the hand up from Mr. Melillo.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we adjourn, I just like to move a motion to resume debate on a previously moved motion by one of our colleagues, and I'll just briefly read the motion
Can I put
again.
You on pause just for a second?
Sure.
I would like to dismiss the witnesses. They're more than happy to stay if they want, but if they choose to
Very quickly,
go on with their day.
Could we ask the rest of the witnesses to provide us their responses in written form because they didn't have a chance to answer my question?
Of course, absolutely. Yes, that goes without saying, yes. If there's anything you would like to add in addition to what you gave in testimony, please feel free to submit that in written form. Okay. So again, did someone say something? No. So again, witnesses, you're free to go if you will, and then we'll discuss some internal business here. So I got Jaime next. I got Lori, and
I make one statement before we leave. We traveled a long ways to come and see you all, and I think if you could just give us, give any one of us just a closing statement before we leave. We'll never see any of you again, most likely.
Well, hopefully
I have the second time to meet Lori, and I'm very grateful for that. But one closing statement, if I may.
Is the committee okay with that? Committee says okay. Okay, Chief Knowlton, the
So
floor is yours.
it was in response to the question that was proposed to all of us here. The one thing that needs to be taken into consideration is the uniqueness of every First Nation across Canada. When you've got over 600 First Nations, none of us our issues are not the same. We may be related, but not the same. The Blackfoot Confederacy are here. We all reside in the Blackfoot ancestral territories, but our issues are vary and are different. And when you look across the country we call Canada now, every First Nation, particularly those in the north, have issues that are uniquely and disastrous to their well-being. And so when the question was asked, what should be done? Penalties for offenders, industrial offenders who are poisoning the drinking and water of my brothers and sisters of the north who are dying at an alarming rate from cancers. Compensation for those First Nations who have to deal with this on a daily basis and who can count on both hands number of people and their families who have died or who have developed and are battling cancers directly related to the waters. And I'm talking about Alberta. We got Suncor. We've got a lot of the oil sands companies up there who are contaminating the fish. We see fish with two heads. We see fish with tumors on them, and that's part of what their livelihood has always been. Down south, we run into a lot of the same things in our area, but maybe not to that extent. We are very lucky, the Blackfoot Nations, that we do have a very good infrastructure. We've put in filterization systems on the nation to ensure our people are safe when the water comes from the source water, like the Old Man River. But the aquifers are directly affected also. Our aquifers were people who are still drinking from the wells, our artesian wells and such. There's high levels of arsenic and other heavy metals to promote lupus, which is prevalent in our nation. And so there's a number of areas, and dealing with the health, I think, is the best issue, is one of the best alternatives moving forward. We know that that Canada is looking at the devolution of our treaties and trying to offload the responsibilities and liabilities, and even including the health, with the HCOM being initiated for all First Nations across Canada. Canada relinquishing, like I said, that liability and offloading it to the provinces and to some of the First Nations that have the capabilities. Not all do. It's a way for Canada to kind of wash their hands of these issues, and we're seeing it more and more and more. And so these are a couple of things. There's a lot more I'd like to say, but given the time frame that y'all have, I'll tell you what, you guys all come to my house, and I'll give you guys the respectful time that you deserve to give us the answers and have this conversation. We work well into the night at home. Some nights I don't get home till midnight. And it's because the work that needs to be done around this table needs to be done. And I don't silence anybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief, for those words. We appreciate, again, the witnesses and their testimony today. Again, if you want to stay, you're more than welcome. If you want to carry on with your day, that's welcome too. Going back to Mr. Melillo, you had the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank all the witnesses for being here. And in the spirit of those closing remarks about the important work that we do have to do, I know that this committee has lots on its plate, and our side previously moved a motion to try to address some of that, and I just would like to reiterate that motion quickly. That given the large workload and expansive mandate of this committee, the committee holds 5 meetings for a duration of 2 hours each between July 8th and September 13th to address the housing on First Nations and produce a report with policy proposals to build more homes and solve chronic housing challenges on First Nations communities. Mr. Chair, that was previously moved. Unfortunately, the other members from other parties adjourn that debate, and I would just like to move that we resume debate on that important motion. Thank you.
So we have a motion to resume debate on the previous motion made, I guess last committee, to meet through the summer. I have a quick speaking list. It goes Mr. Batiste, Ms. Sidlout.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I believe that's a dilatory motion that we'll have to vote on to move forward.
I believe we're in debate right now, I think. Are we not? Yeah, we're just actually talking about that. Normally, yes, you're right. We had a bunch of people put up their hands. So I can move right to the vote, or we can go to the speakers. The motion is to resume debate. I was just going to go to speakers quickly, but the clerk, I'll defer to the clerk as well. We were just actually talking about that. Yeah, you want to go to the vote? Okay, we'll go to the vote. Yep, Mr. Batiste.
Well, since I have an amendment to this, I've been hearing and seeing some of the tweets online, and since we're not in a hurry to leave, I thought we were, but we're not in any hurry. I'll just say that, what I've heard from Indigenous communities is that they don't want more studies on houses. They want the implementation of their rights. They want the implementation of previous studies, and that's what I would like to make that motion to have that amendment to Mr. Melillo's amendment. I think it's been received in both official languages, and so I'll move that amendment now.
Okay, hang on 2 seconds. We're just on the original motion, which was to resume debate of the last minute. So let's put the question. Would the committee like to resume debate on... No. All right, well, we're going to have a quick vote here.
Mr. Batiste.
Does everyone understand what's going on? Good, okay. So the motion that Eric just brought to the floor is to resume debate on, I guess it was my motion to have 5 meetings throughout the summer. Okay, so we're asking people, do you want to talk about this now? So,
no.
Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Batiste.
No.
Mr. Carr.
No.
Mr. Scarpalasia.
No.
Ms. Atwin.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
Nope.
Mr. McLeod, was that, could you repeat that?
No.
Okay. Mr. Malillo?
Yes.
Mr. Shields?
Yes.
Mr. Zimmer? Yes. Monsieur Lemire?
Oui.
Ms. Edler?
No. No, I say no.
Yeah, you've got 3 yeas and 4.
Motion to adjourn.
Oh, okay, well, thank you. The motion failed, unfortunately, so we will not discuss that. So the motion is to adjourn. Thank you, everyone, for a great session. It was great seeing everyone. Have a safe summer. Thank you.